Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to tackle one of the most powerful and, honestly, personal arguments ever conceived. One that takes place entirely inside your own mind. Yeah, you heard that right. So you can forget about looking through telescopes or digging through ancient texts for a minute. The proof we're exploring today, it starts with something you already have. It's that simple, undeniable experience of your own consciousness. So, what we're talking about here is known as the ontological argument. And what's so cool about it is that it's a proof that unfolds not from faith, but from pure reason. The version we're digging into today really frames it as a journey of self-discovery. It all starts with the data you find right inside your own head. Okay, let's dive in. All right, so the whole argument really kicks off with this first kind of unavoidable fact of our inner lives. We exist, but we're also really aware that we're flawed, We're limited and we're incomplete. I mean, just think about it for a second. We know we're temporary, right? We change, we grow, we mess up. And it's that very awareness, our knowledge that we are finite, that immediately forces our minds to create a contrast, to conceive of its total opposite, something eternal, something infinite, something perfect. And this right here, this leads to a really fascinating philosophical problem. I mean, if everything you had ever known or experienced was imperfect, how could you possibly know it was imperfect? It's like, to even recognize that a line is crooked, you have to have some idea of what straight is in the first place. This is exactly the puzzle that the great philosopher René Descartes wrestled with. He basically concluded that this idea he had of a perfect being, there's no way it could have just come from his own mind. Why? Because he knew his own mind was imperfect. The logic here is surprisingly simple. An imperfect source just can't invent a truly perfect idea. And boom, that's the first major pillar of this argument. The idea is that our awareness of our own limits, it's not just some psychological quirk. No. It's presented as a kind of logical signpost, one that points directly toward a perfect standard that has to exist somewhere outside of ourselves. Okay, so that's our inner world pointing toward perfection. But what about the world outside of us? Well, the second pillar of this argument also kicks off with a really simple, everyday observation. Okay, so check out this logic. Step 1. We look around and we see that pretty much everything that exists has a cause, right? Step 2. This creates a huge chain of causes and effects stretching way, way back. But, and this is step 3, that chain can't logically just go on forever and ever into the past. It just can't. So, step 4, there has to be a single uncaused first cause that got the whole shebang started. Think about it like a real physical chain. Imagine countless links, and each one is being held up by the one above it. Well, what happens if there's no first top link? No anchor holding everything up? The whole thing just collapses into a pile, right? Logically, you have to get to a first link that isn't held up by anything else, a cause that itself was never caused. That's the only way for the entire chain of reality to hold together. And philosophers have a pretty cool name for this uncaused first cause. They call it a necessary being. Now, what does that mean? It means it's a being that has to exist, just by its own nature. It doesn't depend on anything else for its existence. In fact, everything else depends on it. Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. The argument takes a pretty surprising turn. It connects these purely philosophical ideas we've been talking about to concepts from Jewish mysticism, and the parallel it's pretty remarkable. Okay, let's walk through this together because how this all connects is really powerful. So on the left, you've got our basic psychological experiences, right? Our awareness of just being. That's the first one. That inner feeling leads us to that philosophical conclusion of a necessary being. And here's the link. In Jewish mystical tradition, that maps directly to the divine name Ahi, which means I am. See the connection? Now let's look at the next row. Our awareness of thought and how it's imperfect. That points us to the idea of a perfect being. Theologically, that corresponds to the name Yah, a name for God signifying perfection.
And finally, our awareness of activity in the world, cause and effect, that leads us to the first cause. And this is reflected in the name Elohim, which is tied to causality and power. It's this incredible direct line from our inner experience to a philosophical concept to an ancient theological name that makes this take on the argument so unique.
So after this whole journey, from deep introspection to pure logic and even into theology, where does that leave us? Let's bring this all together and land on the final conclusion. When you boil it all down, this isn't an argument that asks you to look for external evidence. The entire case is built on rational introspection. It's really about following the logical trail that starts with the simple, undeniable fact that you exist and you can think about your own existence. And it's really important to get this next part. The argument isn't proposing 3 different gods or 3 different beings. Not at all. Instead, what it's suggesting is that these 3 totally distinct lines of reasoning, the one from our imperfection, the one from causality, and the one from our own sense of activity, they all converge. They all point to a single source that embodies all 3 of these qualities at once. All of this powerfully echoes the most famous version of this argument, which comes from St. Anselm. His definition of God was simple but profound, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And his point was, if you can truly conceive of such a perfect being, then it must exist in reality. His logic? Well, a being that actually exists in reality is obviously greater than a being that exists only as an idea inside your head. Now, I have to say, this is one of the most famously debated points in all of philosophy. Critics, both back then and today, basically argue that you can't just define something into existence. The philosopher Immanuel Kant, for example, argued that existence isn't a property like blue or heavy that you can just add to a concept to make it greater.
And so that is the really provocative question that this whole argument leaves us chewing on. Is the idea of God completely unique? Is it the one concept that, if you can truly and fully grasp it, logically demands its own existence? A thought that might just contain its own reality.